very good overview of the work of the Innocence Project and the issues involved in wrongful convictions. When Bob and I got together after a program that we had put on Law Day, in which we had brought in an exoneree, we decided that this would be a great opportunity to combine the arts with a very important issue involving our legal criminal justice system. And we realized that the movie does give you a great overview, but probably the thing that makes you most aware of this issue of wrongful convictions is meeting face-to-face with someone who has suffered the horror of having gone to prison for years for a crime that he did not commit. If you think back to the year 1985, and since we're in a political week, I believe that was the beginning of Ronald Reagan's second term in office. Since then, we've gone through Ronald Reagan, George Bush, 8 years of Clinton, 8 years of George Bush, George W. Bush, and during that entire period of time, Alan Newton has been in prison for a crime he did not commit. Alan is from the Bronx, or was convicted of a crime in the Bronx in '85, and he was exonerated in the year 2006. You don't want to hear the story from me, you want to hear the story from Alan. It's an incredible story, and so I'm going to turn this floor over to Alan to tell you his story.
Thank you, Larry. Good evening, everyone. In 1984, I was a 22-year-old young man working for the New York Telephone Company, which is now 9X in the city, Verizon. The #1 movie at that time was Ghostbusters. I'm sure a lot of people remember that, though. I went to see that movie that weekend with my wife, her kids, and her family, though. Unfortunately, a woman was brutally attacked in the Bronx. She was raped twice, sodomized, her eye was cut out. I was arrested for that crime. Attempt murder, kidnapping, robbery, assault, weapons possession. I had alibi witnesses that proved I was in another borough at the time this crime happened, at 3 o'clock in the morning. My fiancée testified, my daughter testified. Unfortunately, I was still convicted of that crime. I was picked out because in 1979, when I graduated from high school, I was at a party with a group of friends, and we got in a fight with another group of young men. I was arrested for misdemeanor assault. And because I was working as a bank teller at the time, before I graduated in high school, I was missing days going back and forth to court. So I decided to take a plea. And I pled guilty to that misdemeanor assault. 5 years later, this woman is brutally attacked in the Bronx. And I had a photograph that was still in the books. And the woman claimed my photograph resembled the person that attacked her. Not only did she pick my photograph out, but the convenience store clerk in the store said I resembled the person that came in the store that was with the woman. Now this convenience store clerk, though, she was working for 12-hour shift. She said I was the only person that came in the store that she didn't recognize, that she didn't know from the neighborhood. This is why she remembered my face so vividly. Now when this woman was attacked in the park, she was actually attacked 2 times. She was raped, robbed, and sodomized in the park. And after this happened, she didn't say she was going to call the police. She didn't say she was going to a call box to call 911. She said she was going to catch a cab to go home. But before she said she was going to catch a cab, she claimed that she ran after the person that attacked her to get her money back, her $15 and a pack of cigarettes. She said the guy gave her money back. And then she went to catch a cab to go home. She said this man came up and abducted her again. And this time he took an abandoned building. He raped her again, robbed her again. And the only difference between the attack in the park and the attack in the building was this time the woman had her eye cut out. Now, there's no dispute that she was assaulted because the eye was cut out. We know that for a fact. But for all the crimes that happened in the park, I was found not guilty of. Everything that happened in the building, I was found guilty of. And my lawyer questioned the jury later on and asked them, well, how can you find them not guilty for things over here and guilty for what happened over here when the woman is saying the same attacker? The jury told my lawyer that we felt these two people knew each other and something went wrong. Even though there was no testimony that me and this woman knew each other. So I was convicted and sentenced to 40 years. My mom's passed away a year later. My dad eventually passed away while I was still in jail. For the first few years, I was going through shock, trying to understand why me? Why me? I still ask myself that question today, though. But when things wasn't going my way in the penitentiary, the courts was denying my motions, I had to start taking charge of my life, though. I went back to college while I was in there. I tried to do things to keep me busy. And I started working on my case, though. Before I went to jail, I always tell people I wanted to be a banker, though. I lost that passion, though. I started studying law for 20 years now. I got kind of good at it. I got to the point where I was able to help others, though. But one thing I couldn't do, I couldn't help myself, though. Because I didn't want to come home on a technicality facing them type of charges, though. I grew up in a family with 5 sisters. I had 5 nieces at the time. I have about 10 or 12 of them now. But I didn't want to get released on a technicality, though. I wanted to prove my innocence 100%. So in 1988, I asked my legal aid lawyers, I said, could we try to get blood typing done on the rape kit? So we found the rape kit. We tried to test it. The testing couldn't be done because they said the samples had deteriorated to the point where no testing could be done. So that avenue was closed on me. In 1994, New York State passed a law that says anybody that's incarcerated that would like to prove they're innocent, we would offer them DNA testing for free. This was July of 1994. 2 months later in September, I had my motion in the court, petition in the court. I would like to get testing done. The district attorney's office in the city claimed that they couldn't find the evidence. For that reason, the court denied my motion. In 1998, I filed another motion because this time they found the victim's clothing. The victim claimed that the perpetrator had ejaculated inside of her and she felt semen running down her legs before she put her pants back on. So any evidence that may have been on her legs should have been on the pants. Well, we found the pants and tested it. There was no evidence on the pants. My motion was again denied. In 2001, I put another motion in. I kept petitioning the courts. They claimed the evidence couldn't be found. So my motion was denied again. I went to the parole board 3 different times. And each time I got denied because I refused to take any type of sexual offender programming. Because I knew I hadn't committed the crime and I wasn't too ready to admit guilt to try to get out of jail. Even though there was no guarantee, even if I had admitted guilt, I would have came out. So 3 times I went before the parole board, and each time they denied me. One time when I told them I have DNA evidence in the court that I'm trying to get tested, they told me for the purpose of this hearing, that's irrelevant. And because I wasn't taking a sexual offender program, legally the parole board couldn't release me. So I had in my mind, I wasn't trying to go to the parole board no more. So my family got in contact with the Innocence Project in 2004, 2005. And one of the things my attorney, Vanessa Parkin, expressed to me at the time, there's a good possibility your evidence may not exist no more. But I told them to go ahead anyway and try to find it and test it. Well, they found the evidence in my case with the help of the Innocence Project because they have a history of finding evidence. They have a history of working with district attorney offices around this country. So they found the evidence, and when they found the evidence, I told my family, if this evidence is not tampered with, I'm coming home. Because one thing we know, I hadn't committed that crime. And when they found the evidence, I say this facetiously, the police department actually did their job when they found the evidence. because the evidence was right where it was supposed to be all the times I was looking for it. But nobody just wanted to go looking for it though. I could have got out of jail in 1994. So the evidence was found and it was tested. And I also tell people I have a second birthday now. I consider July 6th my birthday also. Because that's the day I walked out of court, a free man, after 22 years in a penitentiary for something I didn't do. And one thing I like to express to people, the same way it happened to me, it can happen to anybody else out here. Because unfortunately, I lack the resources, I lack the knowledge at the time to be able to defend myself in a competent manner. But I entrusted myself with an attorney. It was a paid, retained attorney. And unfortunately, he wasn't competent enough to be able to handle the complexities of my case. My case dealt strictly with an identification issue. There was no biological evidence against me. There was no fingerprint evidence against me. It was just somebody saying I looked like the person that attacked them. Faulty identification could get anybody wrongfully convicted. Over 200 people have been exonerated through the help of the Innocence Project. When I came home in 2006, one of the things people asked me, do I believe there's any more innocent people inside the penitentiary? And I answered a definitely yes. And because I was one of the lucky ones that had biological evidence to test, I know there was a lot of other people that didn't have evidence to test. And because of that reason, they would never be able to prove their innocence. Because this rush to judgment, and it's like Barry Sheck spoke about in the film, this rush to finality. We all want to see a perpetrator convicted for a crime they committed. But too often, the first person that may get accused or the first person that may get arrested for the crime, a lot of times is not the person that committed the crime. And law enforcement, and they rush to judgment, once they lock somebody up, and even if evidence is pointing towards somebody else, they're reluctant to pursue that. Because if you release somebody else, it raises a reasonable doubt on anybody else that may get arrested in the case though. Since I've came home, I just graduated this past May with my bachelor's in business administration. I have a goal now to go into law school and complete my mission, because one of the things I realized, I had nobody to call on in my time of need that was able to give me some advice or assistance. And I want to go on to law school and get my law degree and be able to give back now. Because to whom much is given, much is expected. I received a lot of blessings, fortunately, since I came home. But I know there's a lot of other exonerees that's not in my position. So I definitely want to be able to give back to others who may find themselves in a similar position, or I just want to be able to help fellow exonerees that came home that's not in the same position that I was able to get when I came home. In closing, I would just like to ask, because the people that's here is people that's interested in issues like this. We must take a more vigilant approach when we deal with the courts. We must become more vigilant. We must decide, if we ever sit on the jury, to ask them tough questions that the prosecutor don't ask sometimes, that the defense attorney don't ask sometimes, and that the judge may gloss over. We must, as private citizens, ask them issues. Because every time somebody's sent to jail for something they didn't do, the person that actually committed the crime is still out there, which makes this a public safety issue also. One of the things I expressed when I came home at the press conference was sympathy for the victim in my case, because I understand also neither one of us received justice. Because the person that actually committed that crime could have been her neighbor, could have been somebody that she was passing by on in the street every day. And expressing that sympathy for the victim, a lot of people reached out to me because they was asking me, where's the bitterness and where's the anger? And I told him, if I'd have held on to that bitterness and anger, I wouldn't have made it home after 22 years. I would have got caught up in the system. I'd have got caught up in everything else that was going on. I expressed that bitterness and anger in my work, though. Everything I do today, whether it was going to school, whether it's practicing for my law school exams, whether it's speaking before an audience, I express that bitterness and anger in the work I do because I realize, for one thing, how important it is to keep innocent people out of the penitentiary and save the penitentiary for the people that actually belong to be there. Thank you.
And we're going to have, after some comments by our other speaker, we're going to have an opportunity for any and all of you to ask any questions of Alan. And then following the question and answers, we have a reception that we'll be holding in Fountain Elms, some a little food and some wine, and a good opportunity for you to actually visit face-to-face with both of our guest speakers. Our other guest speaker just arrived here this evening from New York. Alba Morales is a staff attorney with the Innocence Project in New York City. She's a graduate of Brown University and NYU Law School. She clerked for the Honorable Rosemary Barquette, who was a federal judge on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals out of Atlanta, actually Miami. And she then worked for the Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn, where she was doing primarily public defender work representing criminal defendants. She then left there, worked for some time with the law firm of Emery Celli, and then a little over a year and a half ago joined the Innocence Project in New York City. I introduce Alba Morales.
Thank you. Al Newton ended up in prison based on wrongful eyewitness identification. There were a lot of things that went horribly wrong with the system to get him to prison, and there were even more things that went wrong after he was in prison that kept him there for entirely too long. And I just want to make a few brief comments about the causes of wrongful convictions, which are many. Al's mistaken identification, we have found, has happened in over 75% of the 200 plus DNA exonerations that the Innocence Project has kept track of. It's by far the leading cause of wrongful convictions. False confessions, another major cause of wrongful convictions. Approximately 25% of the DNA exonerations have shown that wrongful confessions actually contributed to that conviction. Faulty science. DNA is incredibly reliable, it keeps getting more and more advanced every day, but there are people in prison who were put there based on serology, things like hair comparisons, fingerprints, things that have been proven to be fallible, have contributed to those wrongful convictions. Testimony by informants, what we call snitch testimony, people who are testifying with a vested interest. They're getting offered better deals on the crimes that they themselves have committed, and that testimony is being used to convict innocent people. There is government malpractice, prosecutorial misconduct being the main example of this, and also bad lawyering and ineffective lawyering by public defenders. But really, eyewitness misidentification, it's something, as somebody who used to be a public defender, I had cases where eyewitness ID was the main source of evidence against it. And I'll tell you, as a defense attorney, it was one of the scariest things was to have a witness who put your client at the scene, who said this is the person who did it. These are people who have been victimized. They have experienced terrible things. They have been victims of crimes. And in the DNA exonerations we found, it's not a case of people are fabricating these things, people are trying to put the blame on somebody, but they're really genuinely mistaken. And it's horrible, and when I was a defense attorney, it's very difficult to get around that kind of testimony when you have somebody who, and I don't know your case, Al, but I'm assuming that the witness there was very sympathetic. Nobody deserves to have anything like that happen to them ever. And you have a jury that, it's human nature, you want justice, you're crying out for justice, and you're trusting these government agents to have brought you the right person, and you end up with a situation like Al's. The hopeful part of all of this, I mean, there's a lot of sadness here, and Al's right, there absolutely are innocent people sitting in jail today, and the lucky among them do have DNA evidence, and that we'll be able to find, but there are a lot of crimes where DNA doesn't even come into play. So that's not even an option for them. There are a lot of crimes where there is DNA evidence that has been lost, that's been destroyed, and those people will never see justice, and that's a tragedy. But there is some hope, and I am hopeful that we'll be able to improve the system. We as a society deserve a better system. The people who are being put through that system deserve a better system. In the case of eyewitness identification, it's one of the areas where really the fixes aren't hard. It's possible to make eyewitness identification procedures more precise, more reliable. Things like double-blind proceedings, and right now, as it stands in most jurisdictions, the officer who's conducting the identification procedure, whether it's a photo array, as in Al's case, whether it's a lineup, whether it's a show-up, they know who the suspect is. And whether it's overtly and on purpose, or I think most of the times probably just completely unconscious, are giving cues to that witness that are guiding them to the person who is the suspect in the case. If you have a double-blind system where the officer who's conducting the lineup or whatever the procedure is doesn't know who the suspect is, you eliminate that potential for those unconscious cues to affect the witness. If you have sequential lineups, right now in most jurisdictions you have a lineup where you have 5 or 6 or however many people, one of whom is a suspect, the rest of whom are fillers, and so what happens is the eyewitness, again, not because they want to get somebody, they want to get the wrong person, but because it's human nature, they're looking and they pick out the person who looks most like the perpetrator, whether or not the perpetrator is actually in the lineup. If you have a sequential lineup where they're shown one person, is this the person? No, okay, move on to the next person. They're more paying attention to the person that's in front of them. You know, I'm not a forensic scientist, I'm not a psychologist, but there are people who've done studies that show that this is a more effective way to make sure that you're getting the right person. There are a lot of things, and some jurisdictions have adopted these procedures. And again, it's not hard. There's simple fixes that can really make the system that much better. And all of us, victims, defendants, and we as just members of the society deserve better, and we can do better, and we are all obligated, I think, to fight for these changes and to make sure that we have the best system that we possibly can, because having even a single innocent person in jail is just, it's unconscionable and it's not right, and we can fix it and we should, and I'm hopeful that we will.
Open the floor to questions at this point. I will tell you this, that I've spent most of the day today with Alan, and there are very few questions that he won't answer, so I can urge you to ask questions about anything and everything about his experience. And so
I'm going to pass among you with the microphone, and as one question finishes, raise your hand and I'll come and find you for the second question. And then we'll start with you.
Said you had incompetent lawyers along the way. What responsibility do they have in representing you, or did you end up, proving that they didn't do their job to represent you in your best interest?
Well, the only reason I found out that my lawyers wasn't doing the best that they could have been doing or should have been doing was when I learned more about the law myself, though. Because the less I knew, the less my lawyer did. So later on, years later, when it reached the point where I knew more about the law, I was able to get more out of my attorneys, though. This is why I tell people today when I speak to youth groups how important it is to have some legal or medical training in your family, because it's two professions that can cost you your life or your liberty, though.
But why, I don't understand why, I guess that probably should have been a question to you on, why are lawyers able to get away with this? I mean, I'm talking like a simple divorce, and you go through 4 lawyers that are incompetent, and you do all the work. Why do they get away with that?
well, first of all, every lawyer has expertise in certain areas, and some of us may be stronger in some areas than others. In Alan's case, and we talked about this, Alan and I, today, I think in his case, it was a lawyer who really waited probably too much until the last minute to prepare for trial. And although he was competent perhaps in his abilities, may have, in this case, given it less attention until the last minute than he should have. And you're right, that's wrong, and lawyers do suffer liability for that if they do commit, if they are negligent. But in this case, it was just a question of the lawyer having judgment that just didn't work out.
That cost him 20 years of his life.
I understand that.
I'd actually like to address that question, if I may. I mean, and I can only speak to the criminal side of it. There are malpractice laws in terms of civil practitioners, but there's a very there's a pretty low standard for attorney performance in this country, and a criminal defendant who's been wronged by his attorney can bring an ineffective assistance of counsel claim. Unfortunately, it's not something that, it's not a very high bar. The courts will give a lot of leeway to strategic decisions, and anything that they say, might have been strategy is often allowed and permitted. But, and this might just be my personal bias again because I was a public defender, but I think it's also a systemic issue. I mean, criminal defense attorneys, and let's not forget that there's also prosecutorial misconduct involved in some of these cases, but criminal defense attorneys get away with what we as a society allow them to get away with. Those are the terms that you're choosing to use. Criminal defendants as a class in the society don't have a particularly powerful voice. And therefore, by association, criminal defense attorneys, particularly, I'm talking about public defenders more specifically, also don't have a powerful voice. And there are a lot of jurisdictions where they're overworked, they're underfunded, there's not parity between a public defender office and a DA's office, and you're talking about people who aren't getting paid very much and who are being weighed down with caseloads that are astronomical. And you have a court system that is geared towards, as Alan pointed out, just, it's rush to judgment. Let's clear these cases, let's move this docket. And I know anecdotally stories from all over the country of public defenders who get called to go to trial. If you guys read the book Actual Innocence, the Barry Scheck, Peter Neufeld book, I think within the first 3 chapters, there's a story of Marion Coakley, I believe his name is, and his attorney had just finished a big felony trial, and I think the next day, Marion's case was up, and this defense attorney was a legal aid lawyer in the Bronx and begged for an adjournment. Told the judge, look, I'm not prepared, I can't do a good job here, I need at least a week, I'm just coming off of this crazy trial schedule, and the judge wouldn't give him the time that he asked for. So yes, I think there are defense attorneys out there who are not doing the job that they should do, but I think that we also need to be mindful that systemically there are so many problems, and my personal belief is that the rights of criminal defendants are not always valued and taken seriously. And so we need people like you who are concerned about these issues, to raise them and to be the voice for people who have no voice. So again, just something to keep in mind. But that said, there are lawyers who do not rise to a basic level of competence. There are malpractice laws. There are ineffective assistance claims that can be brought, but like everything else in litigation, you never really know what the outcome is going to be there.
And it costs you money to do that.
We have a question in the back here.
Yes, in the movie it showed that the file cabinets had drawers full of letters from inmates. So how do you pick and choose as to which case you're gonna work on? And also, does New York State have compensation for those who are exonerated?
We have an amazing intake department at the Innocence Project, and their job is basically to go through these letters, to read them, to gather all the documentation. When we can, or when they can, I should say, they read the trial transcripts, they try to get whatever previous motions have been filed, and they basically do an initial screening. And if they find that a case meets our mandate, and our mandate basically is if there's any case where the biological evidence could prove innocence, that fits our mandate, that's a case that we can take. So once they weed out because there are a lot of cases that don't actually meet the mandate that do write into us. So once they weed out the ones that don't fit into that mandate, they bring them to a meeting with the legal staff, and we go over each case and we decide which ones make sense for us to take, which ones are actual viable cases.
Well, New York State, fortunately, New York State is one of the few states that actually has a compensation statute, but you must go back into court, which entails another 2 to 4 years.
And it's those 25 states have so about half the states have compensation statutes, and half of them don't. And that's another thing. New York has one, but it's a travesty as far as I'm concerned. That and it has been mostly men exonerees. So when I'm using the pronoun he, it's for that reason. But it's just tragic that these guys have had their lives and really the best years of their lives. I mean, the productive years, the years that all of us spent, going to school, having, just meeting our spouses, building our careers. People like Alan spent in jail, and then they have to come out and start from nothing. And so that's another area where if you guys want to get involved, go to the Innocence Project website, and just really the more people we have who are active and out there lobbying and supporting, we have a policy department that tries to get these laws passed and works on them, but supporting us in our efforts and other organizations that do this work, the better our chances of getting to a world where all 50 states have compensation statutes, which you can never compensate Al for the years that he lost. There's no amount of money in the world, but the compensation statutes are a start and a good way to, to help these guys make a fresh start after so much has been taken away from them.
Did you have a question here?
I don't have a question, I just have a comment. Congratulations on your exoneration, and you're right. It can happen to anybody's family. It happened to our family. My name is Sylvia Barnes-Bouchard. My son Stephen has been in prison 19 years, 5 months, and 5 days for a murder he didn't commit. Thankfully, the DA has come forth with evidence, and thank be to God, Innocence Project has taken on my son's case, and Alba Rouse has worked effortlessly to prove his innocence. Our judicial system is broken, it's badly in need of fix, and there's people like the Innocence Project and you and Alba that's going to solve this problem. And I want to thank Alba and everyone at the Innocence Project for the work you've done for my son. Thank you, Alba.
Thank you.
Thank you for the comment.
Back here.
My name is Carl Jecton. I'm a local tax attorney, so you might say, well, what's my interest in the Innocence Project? I'm a big John Grisham fan. I've read every one of his books. I have them all autographed. In fact, I met the gentleman several years ago. I'm in Florida on vacation, and I read the latest in the sequel or in the series, The Innocent Man. And my friends that were with me can attest to the fact, a number of times I took the book and threw it down and said, this can't be a true book. There's no way that this can be a true book. Some of the prosecutorial misconduct and the things that went on in the book, it was just mind-boggling. Then I followed it up. There was a special on NBC explaining the same thing. And I said, this can't be the case. And so I guess, I don't know if I have a question or a comment or I'm just venting, but why can't the prosecutorial people, whether it's the County of Oneida, the State of New York, or the U.S. government, why can't they take the lead sometimes and admit and say, we did wrong. We got the wrong man. Let's correct the wrong. But I watched this film for 90 minutes, and nowhere would they accept responsibility for their wrongdoings. And I think until they start doing it, they're never going to get the credence. And I think that's a big start to us. We need to work with them to say, when you're wrong, admit you're wrong. And then people have a lot more faith in you.
You're exactly right. Until we start holding people foot to the fire, nothing is going to change, because every case, every single exoneration, it's almost like you can't believe what happened. It's like when I tell people the victim of my case chased after the perpetrator, people look at me like I'm crazy. When I tell them, I was acquitted for things that happened in the park and found guilty, for everything that happened in the building, they tell me I'm even more crazy because things like this don't happen though. But every case you would read about is always something that's more crazier than the next though.
Is there another question?
Incidentally, as an aside, John Grisham is on the board of directors of the Innocence Project and very active.
Couldn't be here this evening.
I was listening to your story. The thing that interested me about your story was that you had the defense, you had the prosecution, you had you, and you had your witnesses, and you had the jury. And the discrepancy between you in one side and you on the other side, and the jury, the people that were on that jury, I mean, is there any form of manipulation that goes on in the courtroom so that the jury, when they go into the deliberation, when they decide what's going to happen on the outcome of the case, is there some kind of thing that's going on between the defense, or not the defense, but the prosecutor? I mean, the selection of your jury has a lot to do with who you are and how you're handled. I mean, so my question is what is our legal system doing about that process? Because that's an element that seems to be overlooked.
Well, most of the times, all you need is one headstrong person on that jury. And most of the time, that one headstrong person is leaning to the side of the prosecution because everybody want to see justice served by, doing the right thing, as we call it. And unfortunately, doing the right thing sometimes is doing the wrong thing, convicting an innocent person, though. But like I said, it only takes one strong person on the jury. So when you have evidence a lot of times that's going both ways, back and forth, the final outcome is just to convict the person because they're looking at it, this person wouldn't be here if he didn't do so. And a lot of times it's not the case, unfortunately.
I understand that. My other question is that when you're going to the exoneration process and your attorneys are working for you, like Alba does, do they interview, are they allowed to interview the jurors, the jury members after, because part of the transcript is they identify with the jury, don't they? I mean,
That varies among different jurisdictions. I believe in New York you can, I know at least in Ohio you can't. It really depends. I mean, the way that the jury system is, the jury is a sort of sacrosanct, lockbox. Like you really, right, there's no cameras in there, there's no way of knowing what goes on in that jury room. And it's really hard. There's a lot of finality placed on that jury verdict, right?
After the results in the verdict,
Right.
and you going back to overturn, are you allowed to go through and interview each juror, member of the jury that was on there, and then collectively get the group together and find out if that would have changed the whole process?
The way that it works in New York is you're allowed to poll the jury after, if they hand down, really any verdict, either party can, if the DA wants to poll the jury after an acquittal, they can certainly do that, but you basically go down the row and you ask them, do you, Ann Smith, do you stand by this verdict? And they'll answer, but you can't, if your question is whether you can poll the jurors individually away from each other, you can't. The jury gets called out, the foreman reads the verdict, and then you're allowed to go through one by one. And in terms of actually speaking to the jurors, in New York, again, I think that you can, and certainly a lot of times, jurors will approach counsel after deliberations are over, but there are jurisdictions where if you're talking about investigating a case in the post-conviction posture, you are not allowed to approach those jurors. It would be a violation of legal ethics that could get disbarred.
Well, in my case, my lawyer actually asked the jury, after they convicted me, what made y'all come to this verdict? Because you got conflicting testimony from the victim and the police. And this is when they stated that we believe these two people knew each other and something went wrong. Even though it wasn't no evidence, that focused on us knowing each other because the victim said the person that attacked her was a stranger. But they came to this conclusion on their own because the judge allows the jury to determine the facts on their own.
That's the role of the jury, right? And then every judge will instruct a jury, you're the fact finder, I'm just here to instruct you on the law. And again, there's Alan wasn't allowed, no defendant would ever be allowed to be in the jury room. It's really the sacred space in American, criminal procedure. Again, as lawyers, certainly I talked to a lot of jurors after my trials, and judges, at least where I practice in Brooklyn, encouraged us to do that, and it was totally allowed. But once you get post-conviction, things change a lot, and there are jurisdictions that don't allow it.
I guess this question is for Alba. I'm curious about the rationale of the state to make the process of compensation so difficult. In fact, it's been established that a person has been exonerated. He has been imprisoned wrongfully. No one's running around blaming the judge or the prosecutor. It should be sort of a functionary process. So why so difficult is because they can't can't determine the value of the claim, or what is the problem?
I can't really answer that question, and that also sort of varies by jurisdiction. We get glimpses, you know, in Florida, there's, what's his name? The most recent Florida exonerated you met him at the, yeah. And there's a gentleman in Florida who just got compensated, but basically had to wait. And Florida, it's through the legislature, you have to go and they have to pass a special bill, and it's like every time something more important would come up, right? There'd be, you know, some child victim of something that needed something, and it just kept getting pushed off and pushed off and pushed off. And you had, you know, Carl Hyacin is a very well-known writer and a columnist for the Herald, wrote a piece on this gentleman. I can't believe his name is escaping me right now, but you know, and it's just, you know, I think certainly in that case it seemed to be a resource question. I mean, everybody, you know, involved in the process seemed to agree that he deserved to get some money, but the resources never were quite there, and he was, for whatever reason, the first to go. But I think part of it's a resource issue. You know, a lot of times there's a fear of this, you know, they talk about the floodgate, like opening the floodgates of litigation and costing.
Well, wouldn't the compensation alone, the individual who's claiming compensation, wouldn't part of the claim, settlement of the claim, the person would agree not to pursue liability issues? I mean.
Right. No, I agree with you. I mean, I really can't think of a single. I'm just, you know, saying what I've heard and just, you know, following the news coverage and hearing the debate. But I can't think of a single logical issue why you wouldn't say that, you know, these guys don't deserve compensation. But
one of the things that is interesting, while there is a compensation procedure, there have been 23 exonerations in New York State, at least as of last year. And my understanding is that fewer than 5 of those people have received any compensation under this procedure that supposedly allows compensation in New York for people who have been wrongfully convicted. In discussing this with Alan today, we talked about the fact that there are a number of hurdles that are placed in your way when you attempt to get the compensation. Alan, maybe you want to elaborate on that.
Getting compensation is a two-pronged issue. You're dealing with liability and negligent. DNA establishes liability already. Now we're looking at negligent, but they have put a number of exemptions as far as did you have anything to do, you know, with causing your conviction. Now you look at cases where people are coerced into making confessions. If you was coerced into making a confession, it almost eliminates you from being able to collect any type of compensation as far as New York State is concerned. But it's just a long process because as far as the state and the city is concerned, they don't make no mistakes. So they're going to fight you tooth and nails just for you to be able to prove how negligent the state was, and it's basically going on in my case and everybody else's case. It's just this lack of taking responsibility for any wrong that they may have done.
I think we're going to wrap things up. I do know that if any of you have additional questions for Alba or Alan, you're welcome to pose them at the reception after it. I want to ask the last question, and I think both of you can weigh in on it as someone who's experienced the process through the Innocence Project and an employee. Is there any charge to the exonerees who apply to the Innocence Project, and where does the Innocence Project receive its funding for the work that they do?
no, we don't charge our clients, and thankfully we're now in a position where we can pay for DNA tests. That wasn't always the case, but now we pay for everything and we don't charge. And we got a lot of our money, all of our money from private foundations and individual donors. Really, really large percentage of our budget comes from individual donors. People find us online, people giving, $10, $20 a pop. It's pretty amazing, actually. We do have a development department, so we do work on those relationships with foundations and major donors, but it's all private individuals and foundations.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you.